was in the city of Ephesus, where the letter of Timothy was written to, and that what this verse is being written to, the church of Ephesus. There was a thing called the Temple of Diana at Ephesus. Okay, so this was a Greek god temple dedicated to Artemis, the Greek god of, and this was the Greek god of fertility, the hunt, wild animals, the moon, and chastity. Excuse me. And so what was going? This is basically a giant cult. Okay, and you can like Google like what the temple looks like. I did earlier, and so this had major influence over the city of Ephesus at this period of time. I think around like 10 AD, somewhere in there. I could be wrong, but it's somewhere in there. And this had massive influence. And what was going on in this temple, since it was a goddess, not a god, it was a Greek goddess, that this entire temple and religion, really, its cult was ran by women. And not only was it just a religious practice there, but they also sold prostitution and sex and all sorts of sexual immorality in this temple. This is all like true in the city of Ephesus at the same time this letter was written. And so it really, once you learn these historical contexts and these historical truths, it really comes into play, and the puzzles just fall right together. Because there was all sorts of sexual immorality. That's why Paul, he's saying to these specific, not all women, these specific Ephesus women of the church in Ephesus, don't assume, because in that city, it was assumed that women should have power over a man and be able to teach over a man. So Paul's like, okay, we're all on a level playing field here, okay? So that's basically what he's saying.
No, you did great, man. I mean, you just, as far as being silent in the church, you nailed it. You nailed that passage completely. Really, I know, the education of the women, going back at that time, another reason why, a possible reason why Paul would be addressing just that passage. We don't see Paul addressing the Corinthians. We don't see Paul addressing the Galatians or the Philippi. We don't see him addressing these other churches in Asia Minor with this same question. We just see him addressing Ephesus. Another thing to note, a part of that, is that this is like one of the witchcraft, most demonically possessed areas of the modern world at the time. We see that in the book of Acts. We even see that they like take all of their witchcraft books when people get in Ephesus get saved, and they start burning them. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I would even say that maybe even some of these women probably did know how to read, or probably were educated. I haven't read that anywhere. I'm speculating at this time. That's maybe something we can look up, but it's very important to know that these women needed to be silent. One of the reasons being is because, let's say if they were uneducated, let's take that route. If they were uneducated women, they did not know the Torah. They did not know that at that time. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. All Jews at that time would have known. But these are not Jews. These are Greeks. These are non-Jew Jewish believers. Maybe there are some Jews mixed in. Maybe it's a mixed congregation, or it's a house church. I don't know how big the church is, but Paul is trying to set order, and so it has been described. I heard another part of the lecture was that it would be like be like my 7-year-old daughter going into a church service with scholars and just trying to ask the most elementary questions during a lecture. She would be asking, she just doesn't know how to read, so she'd be asking, well, what is that? How come I don't have any pictures? And she'd be bored out of her mind, or she'd be saying things that she's just out of her element completely, because there are fundamental aspects that she just does not know yet. And right. So these women were in that same category as a young person going into a church, or even somebody that's never read the Word of God and they just newly got saved. And it is just a wide open world for them now. They don't even know who Noah is. They don't know Adam and Eve. They don't know all of this huge, vast amount of characters and stories and letters and all of this ways to navigate. They don't know this stuff, and so Paul is saying at this time, well, the men at this time were probably more educated, most likely were because of the culture. Go home and ask your husbands these questions. Ask them so that we're not wasting time with all of these distractions and all of these interruptions. I think we've talking before. We've been there in services where somebody may be innocent and like even asking a question, but like when you're in the middle of a sermon, I'm not going to raise my hand and say, "Hey, I got a question."
Yeah.
Even though that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And it's happened before, you know what I mean? And if anybody's listening to this and you have done that, I don't mean to call you out, but don't do it anymore. It's just, it totally just disrupts the flow. It's like almost like it's just like everyone, it just disrupts. It does not operate in order. And that is I really truly believe that's what Paul is getting at in this verse. He is addressing order in the church, especially if this is a small house church, which most of the churches were small house churches with smaller congregations coming together. And then you have people saying, "Hey, I know you're preaching the word right now. I know you're prophesying, but you know, the Lord did this or did that," or just interrupting.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it is people don't genuinely want to know what you have to ask or anything. It's just that's not the time or the place.
Right. Yeah.
I hope that really came out clear. I don't know if it did or not.
Yeah, I think it did.
And so that's how I really truly feel about that verse. It is a highly debated verse. Scholars way smarter than us. I know I used that phrase last time. They're just they often debate this verse, and they all are in agreement that this verse is hard to translate into English. It's hard to really know what Paul's really saying. And so to go back to the very beginning to negate, and we're about to read this verse is becoming one of my favorite verses, and I didn't even know it really existed until about a week ago. Romans chapter 16. To negate all of what Paul is saying about women, all of the women that he affirmed, all of the times that he says in 1 Corinthians, he says that when women prophesy, they should wear a head covering, and we'll talk about head coverings. But he said when they prophesy, that means he expects women to prophesy. He doesn't expect them to be quiet. So why do we see that contradiction? It's because he, like you said prior to what I just said, it's because he was addressing a certain church and certain problems that only needed to be addressed at a certain church. Does that mean that it's not for us today? Well, we can use those same principles about, like I just said, we address that even with men who raise their hand in the middle of a sermon, or women if they raise their hand in the middle of a sermon. I've probably done the same thing. Hey, I'm raising my hand, interrupting service and interrupting the flow and the order of church.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything you want to share before I go into Romans 16?
Yeah, I mean, you just said like a few sentences ago that I lost my train of thought for a second. You just said like a few sentences ago that it was for then, right? Like what you said. What, like, can you rewind? I have a little bit of headache. I'm losing my train of thought right here.
It's no problem.
You were talking about how it what we can take from it today.
So if I were to apply that verse today, it would be that anybody who is unlearned or they don't know the proper order of worship in church, that means that like a young kid, like my kids had to learn how to sit still in church. They had to learn when it's time to worship, it's time to worship. When it's time for the preacher or the pastor to give a word, it's not time to raise your hand and ask questions.